Right, welcome to another one of my infrequent videos, just to kind of put a counterpoint to some prevailing arguments that are doing the rounds on YouTube and Twitter. So, as you know, the last 24 hours have shown, there's been a major controversy about the AXS app that Blizzard are requiring for use for BlizzCon. Now, I myself was lucky enough to get 2 tickets for this November, so myself and my wife will be heading over there, and I'm really looking forward to it. I think there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff announced there. But there's a lot of controversy that rather than just the printed out tickets that you're able to use at previous BlizzCons, you now require a third-party app on a smartphone. Now, first off, to address the argument about requiring a smartphone at all, I can totally understand people's concerns about the requirement to have a phone, especially if you are using a mobile phone that does not use Android or iOS. I know it's hard to believe, but there are still people out there that have legitimate smartphones, either running the Windows mobile operating system or some of the lower grade Nokia stuff, especially in areas like India and various parts of the developing world. Although Android and iOS is, you know, the predominant systems worldwide and are almost the only two exclusively in the US, there are actually a lot of other options out there on a global basis, and BlizzCon is a global event, so the fact that AXS do not provide their app for other platforms I do think is an issue. What I would like them to see is to integrate that QR code functionality into a web browser that could then be accessed from any device. Providing it conforms to basic HTML5 standards, it should be it should become then platform agnostic, and I would much prefer they went down a route like that. But they have not. I do think it's often symptomatic of the big companies, especially US-based ones, that are only capable of thinking within the borders of the US and often do not have a global viewpoint as to what else is out there. Working for an American company, I'm very familiar with this. So there's been a lot of controversy about the data that the AXS app collects, and some people are crying foul on Blizzard's part. Although I think Blizzard's only involvement is partnering with, you know, one of the major ticketing companies. So I want to go through some of the concerns about the data that this app collects and how it uses it. Some of which I agree with, some of which I think to some extent is people's criticisms are coming maybe from a lack of understanding about how a lot of web-based applications actually work. So I'm going to go through them, and this is partly in response to Akalon's video, which you know, he always produces great content, and so I'm kind of basing this video as a counter argument to his to some extent. So let's get into the personal data. Now, the areas that were highlighted were that it would collect your first and last name, your credit card info, your billing address, your email address, and your phone number. Now, given the fact that this is a platform, this is an app, and as always, most apps just tend to be a wrapper for a website being presented on your phone. Now, given the fact that this app is, at its core, it's a storefront and ticket delivery system, but its primary purpose is as a storefront and to process purchases. Now, none of that information, your name, credit card, billing address, email, phone number, these are all perfectly reasonable pieces of information for it to require to make a purchase on a credit card. or PayPal or whatever other platforms it supports. Now those details will be registered with your online account. How is that effectively different from having an Amazon app on your phone, which will have all your credit card billing details, etc. on it? It's not scraping it from your phone. It is requesting that information to be inputted directly to facilitate purchases. And it only requests that information at the time that you either register an account or proceed to make a purchase, which I would say all that information is a minimum amount required to make a credit card purchase. And obviously that then has to be transmitted back to the source company to actually process that payment. So none of that I see as particularly egregious. Now, if they then selling that on to third parties, that's a different issue, and I'll come to that later. So going on to the next area. So some of the things that people have complained about are the IP address, the operating system, and the device make and model of your phone, that it collects those data and sends those back. I hate to break it to you guys, but that's what any web browser does. It's a necessary step of how web browsers interact with web servers. If it didn't collect your IP address and send it off as part of the web request, there would be no return path information for it to respond to that web request. And if you look at any kind of analytics, be it for Twitch, Google, any major web analytics platform, it's going to be collecting IP addresses. Every ISP collects the IP addresses of every session you ever do. Most of them have to by law. That is how the internet works. It's nothing specific to this application. It's just doing what any web browser does, as its normal mode of operation. And as for the operating system, again, that's a standard part of any web browser. Quite a few web servers will tailor their content specifically to deliver it based on the information it receives back regarding your browser and operating system. A web server will return different content to you if you're using Chrome or if you're using Safari. To make, the idea is to give you the same end product, the same functionality and appearance, but because no two browsers are identical, they often have to serve content in slightly different ways to achieve that. So again, sending that information, it's pretty standard. And if you look across any web analytics platform regarding websites, this is standard information. Device make and model, again, that is pretty standard in the mobile world for browsing. Now, you could argue that people shouldn't collect this data, and I'm not actually trying to justify AXS collecting this data for their app, but the point I'm trying to get across is what they are doing is no different from any app or any website. It is the standard for the mobile internet. Now, whether that should be right, or whether that should be allowed or not permitted, that's a whole different argument. I'm just trying to make the point that AXS is not doing anything out of the ordinary here. So we'll come on to other aspects. Now, other information it connects was things like browsing history, purchase history, app usage, etc. Now, I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding in that some people that I've read on Twitter seem to think that it was monitoring your whole use and behavior on your phone and which apps you are using. I don't think that is the case. It is, from what I understand, it is monitoring, when it comes to app usage, it is monitoring your usage of the AXS app. It is monitoring which events you browse to, which within the AXS app, and your purchase history within the AXS app. and what advertising is displayed, etc. Which is the same as any web browser. If you go onto a website, any website that has banner advertising, there will be metrics collected on what you looked at, what you searched for, what products you viewed. There will be session credentials. Just go to Amazon.com. You'll find all the information about the apps, the products that you've recently looked at. It will track what you viewed. It will make you recommendations based on your past purchase history. And again, you might think this is very Big Brother, but I would argue that providing that data is collected from within the AXS app and submitted back to AXS, I would say that's a reasonable use case for that data, because it is only data around the use of the app, not about what you are doing on your phone in other apps. It is not some kind of elaborate Big Brother spyware app that is collecting data about your entire lifestyle. This is about your interactions with that company, and I would argue that that is a fair use of that data. They do notify you that they are collecting that data, and under data protection laws and GDPR within the EU, that would be deemed as fair use for the purposes for which they inform you. Okay, so that's one aspect out of the way. So we'll come on to the last area, which is a little more dodgy, and I agree with the concerns, a lot of this. The fact that the app can track location, much like Google Maps does, or Uber Eats, or Deliveroo does, for the same purpose. It's a question. They all like to give users the functionality of show me events or restaurants or whatever near me, without having to put in your precise location or address details. Now, whether you choose to opt into that or not is entirely up to you. I personally found the Deliveroo app very useful when I was working on a site in the middle of Dubai 2 weeks ago, and I basically just said, find me things near me and deliver food to my location. Didn't have to put an address, anything. Very convenient. And if you go into the settings of the app or into the app permissions in Android, I won't mention iOS because I don't own an iPhone, so I'll leave that to others to talk about. But it is very simple. Go into the app permissions for the AXS app. You can turn off the location access. You can turn off network access. You can turn off access to contacts. By default, it didn't ask to access my contacts, but the option was there. But, if your device is up to date and you have all the appropriate permissions set, it was very easy to limit what the AXS app can do. I'm not entirely comfortable with a lot of the location tracking stuff. The events, the aspects that some people have talked about regarding things like Bluetooth tracking while at the venue, etc., I'm not particularly comfortable with. I can understand why they do it, because that information is invaluable to any event organizer to try and improve their product over time. And BlizzCon is something that is certainly developing and changing year on year. And I don't think this is anything specific to BlizzCon. This is a standard for large events. Data, knowledge is power, as they say. So that type of data collection, I can understand why why event organisers want it. And if that type of information was just going to the event organisers, I wouldn't have a problem with. But there are concerns about who that information is then fed onto. And those are totally legitimate concerns, and I do agree that people need to be conscious of those things. But, as I said, if you just look in the permissions on your phone, you can turn all of that off. Now, my personal intention is at BlizzCon is on Thursday, the 31st of October. We will go to the event. We will use the AXS app to collect our passes. Once we have the passes for myself and my wife, I will uninstall the app. Once we've actually picked up the passes, I have no reason to have that on my device. And if you have concerns about all these things, I would suggest you do the same. There is no reason to install the AXS app until like the day before BlizzCon, and then just uninstall it straight afterwards. There's no reason to have it on your phone, unless you actually just want to use it for other events, non-Blizzard events, which there seem to be quite a few. I mean, it's one of the big ticketing companies out there, and I can totally understand why Blizzard went with them, because the Blizzard queue process and the ticket purchasing process this time around was a far superior experience and a lot fairer than it has been in the past, where it was basically who can click the button within 0.3 of a second after it goes live, get the ticket. This was managed a lot better through the AXS platform. So I will give them credit for that. Now, there is actually quite a lot of information on the AXS website regarding their privacy policy, and I think that it is worth paying attention to it. Right, so AXS has a fairly well documented and thorough privacy policy area on their website. I am looking at the UK version, which is obviously appropriate to EU legislation, especially 2018's GDPR regulations. For those that aren't aware, they are a common standard. The General Data Protection Regulation Act, I think it is, that applies to all EU countries, and it applies to all companies that are based in the EU and who operate in the EU, regardless of where they happen to be based. So a US company, as ASX is, if they are operating in the EU, they have to adhere to EU data regulations. So they have laid out very clearly what they have the right to collect, and let us be clear, that is not saying what they are collecting. They are just saying this is the type of data we may collect, and then the actions that they intend to do with it. And if you read through it, a lot of that information, as I've said earlier on in this video, are basic information that you need for it to operate, such as personal ID, address, email, contact details, credit card information, etc. Although I do notice on the issue of credit cards that the website processed the credit card information for the transaction of purchasing the BlizzCon tickets, but because I did not select the option to save this financial data for future purchases, it was not collected. It was submitted to whatever credit card company I happen to use for the process of that one transaction, but then was not stored. If you choose to store your credit card with them because you anticipate doing multiple repeat business with this vendor and you want the convenience of that, like I do with Amazon because I buy a lot from them, then that's your choice. It's not something that is mandatory. So again, I'm just trying to put a context on this, and looking through the privacy data page, the types of data that they're saying they may collect, and often they are explicitly saying that it is down to the user to give consent to collect that data, the uses are fairly standard for any online vendor that is in the market space that this particular company is in. Now, what I do find interesting is, as you know, they have to under GDPR, there are specific processing purposes that they have to lay out. It's not just a question of what data do they collect, it's how they intend to use it. And they very clearly lay out in a section called Your Rights and Your Choices what options you have. And for every option, you have the choice to demand that they do not use your data, as is required by law. Now, I cannot speak for the data laws in the US. I'm not that familiar with them. I am fairly familiar with the EU laws because I was part of the team that had to implement GDPR compliance for our company. So it's something I've worked with quite closely. Nothing that they have said on here is particularly egregious or out of character for companies of this type. They are as snooping as Chrome is, and all the AdSense and web browsers. I mean, if you turn off, you can opt out of so much of it if you actually look in the small print. And there is full guides on the AXS website on how to opt out of sharing your data with anybody. Now, if you choose to do that, and I probably will, then feel free, go ahead. I'm actually, in my personal life, I'm quite thorough on restricting the amount of information I give to third parties, and when it is inevitable I do have to give information to them because it's just necessary for the mechanics of the transaction I want to do with them. I'm always quite conscious of limiting what they can do with them. I rarely opt in to anything these days. And one of the good things under the new GDPR regulations is that there is no longer any implicit opt-in. Up before 2018, you would have to manually opt out of the use of your data, whereas now you have to. The opt-out is considered to be the default position, and you would have to manually opt in on. And other things like the data, they ask for details like, do I want to link my Facebook account with my AXS account or my Twitter account, etc., or Instagram, which I don't use. All of which was just said no, and there's no data they can collect. Like everybody else, under the auspices of GDPR, they can really only take the information that you choose to give them. So whether AXS, not an easy name to say, is behaving badly or not, I don't generally think they are. Okay, let me rephrase that. I think they are behaving no worse than any other vendor or web browser or advertiser out there. Now, you might have an issue with how the modern internet works, and I would agree with you that there are some serious issues. GDPR has gone a long way to resolve a lot of them, or at least to clarify them. But as always with the internet, if you sleepwalk into the internet and sleepwalk through these choices, you give them everything. So everybody needs to be aware of how they operate their digital life. I think the whole culture of e-commerce can be very sinister in the way it operates. But I don't think AXS is an exception to this. I'd say they are largely the same as everybody else, for better or worse. So I think the amount of hate that has been generated in the last 36 hours, I don't really feel it is justified. I feel if you have those type of concerns, then you should be speaking to your internet regulators or data protection regulators in your particular country on how data is used, in terms of the regulation specific for your country. Because hell, there are certainly lots of issues out there. But again, I just don't think that this particular app is too much of a concern. As I said, I will install it closer to the time. All my interactions with AXS until this point have been through their website. I have no reason to put their app on my phone until we are closer to the event, and that is only for the purposes of picking up the tickets at the venue. After which I will uninstall it because I will have no use for it. I have all the location tracking, all those aspects, they can be turned off. So the amount of data that I choose to give to them is limited. But the key thing is the amount of data that is given to them is under your own control, if you actually take the time to look at it. And with that, I would just like to thank you for watching this video. I'll post another one again as and when I feel like there's a topic I want to share my thoughts on, which tends to be on a fairly irregular basis. So thank you very much for that. If you want to like or subscribe to my channel, then please do. Yeah, I'll leave it for now. Thank you.